That I'm from Thunder Bay is the most important thing you need to know about me. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and for those of you who've woken up to join us this morning. It's a bit intimidating to go first, given that I'm following a presidential speechwriter, or pardon me, I'm preceding a presidential speechwriter. So you'll have to grade me on a forgiving curve. I'm grateful to speak to you this morning about some of the most important questions facing our societies. Why are large shares of our populations turning to new and disruptive political vehicles? What does it say about our current political and policy frameworks? And what can we and should we do about it? These questions transcend ideology and partisanship. They're bigger than the typical tensions between efficiency and equity, freedom and equality, liberal and conservative, or Democrat and Republican that we're accustomed to. We aren't merely talking about competing political preferences between the 40-yard lines of public debate. There's something more profound going on. Our basic frameworks are under strain. Some of these disruptive public sentiments are no doubt unjustified. They reflect the forces of ignorance, demagoguery, and possibly worse. But the idea that the present populist moment can be principally explained by a combination of crudeness and racism is, in my view, a cop-out. It's a dodge by intellectual and political leaders. It's an attempt to persuade ourselves that our basic assumptions are right and the public is wrong. A mix of more redistribution and better communications isn't an adequate answer to what ails our politics, no matter how much we tell ourselves. It behooves those of us who believe in liberal democracy on the left and the right to think more fundamentally about how to make our economies, societies, and politics more inclusive and responsive. Our answers will differ based on our priors and preferences. That's both healthy and inevitable. But, as I'll argue this morning, this ought to be a shared project. Too much is at stake. I just referred to our differing priors. Let me start with mine. I think it's useful both for the purposes of being transparent and recognizing blind spots. I have a technocratic mind. I'm predisposed about thinking about these issues through a lens of government and public policy. In so doing, I can neglect the role of norms, institutions, and other social factors. I grew up in an entrepreneurial household and can tend to think about these issues through the lens of economic utilitarianism. In so doing, I can neglect non-economic forces such as loneliness or an individual's search for belonging and meaning. I can also, as a result, overemphasize the role of personal responsibility and underemphasize the existence of structural barriers in our society. I believe in the efficacy of markets, the role of incentives, and the benefits of dynamism. But I can also underestimate the threat of corporate concentration, the short-term costs of growth maximization, and the community downsides of what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. I'm a temperamental conservative, which means that I'm skeptical of radicalism and utopianism. Economic, social, and political progress generally comes in the form of incrementalism rather than a big bang, which invariably lead to inadvertent consequences. The risk, of course, is that my resistance to change can cause me to fall victim to a status quo bias. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. I'm a pretty orthodox conservative thinker, or at least I was. The past 36 months have caused me to undergo an ongoing process of introspection. I'm still a conservative. In fact, in many ways, I've become more conservative. But in others, I've started to think more fundamentally about what the rise of populism tells us about conservatism and a renewed agenda for inclusion and responsiveness. It's been a complicated journey. It has led me in new and different directions, and it's far from over. But this exercise of self-analysis is now guiding my thinking about policy and politics. I'm grateful for the chance to reason through these questions with you for the next several minutes. I start by asking, why populism? I recognize that there are competing interpretations of contemporary populism. Some argue that it's principally a manifestation of economic anxieties. Others argue that it's driven primarily by cultural anxieties, including status threat by majority populations. This is a nuanced and evolving empirical question. Harvard economist Danny Rhetoric, who one might argue has been the most proactive and serious thinker on these questions, spoke at the University of Toronto late last year and argued that the two are inextricable. He's of course right, but I only have 15 minutes. So at the risk of simplifying things, I tend to err on the side of the former explanation. Remember, educational attainment is the best determinant of Trump voters. That is to say, the single best predictor of Trump voters is that they didn't go to college. The same goes for Leave voters in the United Kingdom. This is consistent with research about the growing relationship between education and labor market outcomes. Those without post-secondary education tend to be in jobs that are most prone to trade-induced dislocation and automation, and ultimately face the highest levels of precarity. It's intuitive, isn't it? We just have to look around us. General Motors layoffs in Oshawa is merely the most recent and regrettable example. We're going through a process of skills-biased change, whereby developed economies are paying larger returns for cognitive skills and educational credentials and have less demand for routinized or basic skills. The result is that there are increasingly few industries or professions where those without post-secondary education can earn a good living and have economic security. The rising wage gap between those with post-secondary education and those without, more than 55% in Ontario, is evidence of this trend. It's no surprise, therefore, that high-income Canadians tend to be highly educated. 2/3 of the top 1% of earners have a university degree, versus about 20% of those without post-secondary. This is hardly unique to Canada. Research by the bipartisan Hamilton Project in the United States finds that workers with a college education are now the majority in the top 2 income quintiles. Education has thus become the greatest source of differing outcomes and opportunities in today's economy. It has increasingly come to trump more conventional determinants of wealth and opportunity, such as race or family structure. The upshot is that we have an economy that will continue to pay higher returns to those with certain credentials and skills, but that undervalues traditional aptitudes such as physical strength and hard work. The winners in this new economy fall into the former camp, the losers into the latter. The twin trends of globalization and technology have disrupted or threatened traditional sources of middle-class opportunity, including, for instance, manufacturing employment. One proof point. A recent Ball State University study found that the U.S. manufacturing sector kept 2000 levels of productivity and applied them to 2010 levels of production, it would have required 20.9 million manufacturing workers rather than 12.1 million. That's nearly the equivalent of the productivity-driven destruction of every job in New York City. That this scale of disruption has manifested itself not just in our economy, but also in our culture and our politics should hardly be surprising. The consequences have been well documented on the left and the right. We've observed growing evidence of wage stagnation, financial insecurity, and place-based dislocation. And in turn, we've observed increasingly destructive behavior amongst working class populations and a growing turn to non-conventional politics. These trends are, in my view, and the view of various others on the center right, including Charles Murray, Ed Glazer, and Nick Eberstadt, inextricably linked. The key here is the following. Economic opportunities increasingly bifurcated based on one's education levels and geography. It's important to emphasize that this is unique in modern history. The economics of credentialism and geography have never been stronger. It, of course, leads to the question, what can we do about it? I've moved quickly through my presentation to get to this point. It's here where I think I have the most to offer the audience, not in the form of answers, but perhaps in the form of questions to try to guide this conversation across the political spectrum. The progressive predisposition to redistribution may be well-intended, but I would submit it's an incomplete agenda. Not only will it fail to fully address populist demands, it can come at the harm of economic dynamism that's at the root of modern society. And I don't think this tension can be underemphasized, or overemphasized, pardon me. Analysis by Pog Krubin and others defending Alexander-Cortez's proposals for a 70% tax rate for high-income earners, in my view, fails to address this tension, these trade-offs between efficiency and equity. Their analysis is predominantly concerned with revenue intake, but such analysis fails to account for the effects on entrepreneurialism, innovation, and so on. The results may be higher levels of equality, but the cost may come in the form of less dynamism. At its core, this morning's discussion, in fact, is about the question of tensions between economic security, economic dynamism, efficiency and equity, and so on. How we respond to these questions will, in my view, determine our politics for the years to come. I would just add, there are empirical considerations to bring to bear in tackling these questions. But fundamentally, they're ultimately normative in nature, and the left and right both have something to offer in how we respond to them. A proportionate political and policy response will require that we draw from both sides of the ideological spectrum. The left's emphasis on institutional barriers to social mobility and the role of public policy to break them down will be an essential component. The right's thinking about the role of families, the dignity of work, and the limits of state action will also play a key role. This cannot be an all or nothing proposition. But let me spend the last few minutes I have with you talking about my own personal journey and what insights it may offer you as policymakers, scholars, and social activists as you grapple with these questions. The question, of course, in front of us is, what can we do as those committed to community democracy to arrest this trend towards unrooted populism on the left and right? My comments aren't about tinkering on the margins. They reflect a growing view that we require more fundamental changes to our economy, society, and politics, which I admit is an odd conclusion for a conservative. But as I mentioned in my introduction, my thinking is still being refined and have benefited greatly from this weekend's exchange. In this vein, as I say, I'm afraid you'll have to settle with a series of questions rather than a series of answers. 1, the current episode of globalization, what Rhetoric has called hyperglobalization, has disproportionately harmed certain industries, regions, and peoples in Western countries, yet has also contributed to the most significant reduction in poverty around the globe in human history. How should we judge a policy framework that increases domestic inequality but lowers global inequality? Are we prepared to trade off lower inequality inside our own borders, even if it involves less income and wealth in the developing world? How do we think about that tension? 2, redistributive tools can help to distribute welfare gains stemming from globalization from the so-called winners to the so-called losers in the form of higher taxes and accompanying cash transfers. Is this a sustainable strategy? How can we properly measure the efficiency and equity trade-offs? Are higher taxes on high-income earners justified merely as a political initiative, even if the empirical case is weak? And for how long will the losers be prepared to accept a policy that's focused on buttressing their consumption, but not focused on their inherent needs to be productive? 3, inequality seems to be a motivating force in our politics. How do we define inequality? Should we care about it? Why? Does it respond to public demands, or are people asking for something else? People rightly want fairness, but I'm not sure that's the same as equality. And this is a tension that I think we're going to continue to have to grapple with on the left and right. There are ultimately big trade-offs between dynamism and security, that I think are at the core of this ongoing effort. 4, Canada has achieved world-leading rates for educational attainment. Now 60% of those between the ages of 25 and 64 have a post-secondary degree. This amount will grow even higher due to demographics, improved post-secondary access, and the possibility for further nudges to target low-income and other marginalized voices. But recognizing that the considerable population will never attend post-secondary, what should policymakers do to respond to their needs and interests? What does a pathway to a non-post-secondary future look like? How should we reconceptualize public funding to support the 2/3 who go to university or college and the 35% who don't? More localism, as my fellow panelists yesterday, Ken Bosenkool and Brian Dykman, observed, would help, conceptually at least, to expand political responsiveness and accountability. Yet some organizations are skeptical of localism due to bad experiences and concerns that certain communities and groups will be excluded. How can we advance an inclusive vision of the idea of subsidiarity? What is the role of government to facilitate such an approach? And lastly, if you accept the premise that redistribution of welfare gains resulting from a dynamic economy are a necessary yet insufficient response to growing public sentiments about economic security, what more structural changes are we prepared to accept? Are we willing to absorb welfare losses to provide more employment security for certain workers? What are the policy implications? And will the public actually support an agenda that over time produces less dynamism and higher prices? These, in my view, are the fundamental questions that we must confront as a society on both the left and the right, especially the final one. I'm afraid, as I say, I don't have answers. I'm still on a journey, but I'm grateful for the chance to reason through them with you. Thanks again to the organizers for inviting me. I really think we're at a crossroads. And we shouldn't flinch from it. These conversations are dynamic, serious, and unsure. The best we can do is to be in the arena. And I'm grateful for the chance to join you this morning. Thank you so much.
Sean's taller than I am. Is that okay? Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay. Good morning. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here today, and Sean and Karim. It's a real privilege to be with you all. And there was actually a brief moment about a month where it wasn't clear that I would make it to your lovely city. You may have heard we've had some trouble across your southern border. Our government shut down. The United States federal government actually shut down for more than a month. Thousands of government employees were furloughed while others were forced to work without pay. And then finally on Friday morning, it was reported that LaGuardia Airport in New York was grounding flights due to a lack of air traffic control staff, whom you definitely need to operate airplanes. So my flight was scheduled for last night. So I wasn't sure whether the shutdown would affect airports in Washington, which is the center of my country's dysfunction and also, as it happens, my home. And so it wasn't until Friday that President Trump relented for now in his pointless fight to build a wall on our southern border. And so the government was reopened at least for another 3 weeks. And so here I am. All of this is to say, for any of you who are mesmerized by a populist politician, please beware, or your government might shut down. So I'm thrilled to be with you, and you all seem to have a functioning democracy, and I may or may not apply for asylum while I'm here. And I also really enjoyed listening to Sean and found it really instructive to listen to a Canadian conservative, or what we in the States call a liberal. So you might be unsurprised to find out that I really do agree with Sean on a lot of what he said, and I won't kind of go recap his assessment of some of our ills, and I think his assessment of the nature of the economic anxiety and the reasons for it are accurate. And so this is a giant subject, so I'm just going to touch on the tiniest slice of it. And I'll just offer some thoughts as what I see as the nature of the populism we see today. And like your typical American, I'm going to do that by focusing on America, because we can't be bothered to learn about any other country. And I also want to echo what Sean said, that the challenges that we're talking about today really do transcend political ideology. And I agree that we can't just tinker at the margins. We need a fundamental shift in our politics to address what are clearly trends that are alarming people on both sides. And the primary argument I will make is this: the populism we see in my country is inextricably linked with racial resentment. And this is also true in other places where populism is on the rise, though to varying degrees and for varying reasons, which I hope we'll get into in our discussion. But in America, there's no question that populism and racial resentment are linked, as personified in the modern era by the rise of Donald Trump. And I would argue that to overstate the role of economic anxiety, or rather to speak of it in isolation, outside of the context of social and cultural factors, and to therefore minimize the role of racism and racial resentment, will only exacerbate what I believe is a crisis in our democracy. We have to face the truth if we're going to overcome it. So the idea of coming to you to speak to you guys about populism, especially after Sean, who has real knowledge as a policy person, was daunting. I'm not a political scientist, I'm not an economist, I'm not a sociologist or a historian, I'm just a speechwriter. But on further consideration, it occurred to me that populism fundamentally is more about rhetoric than ideology. Put another way, populism is a thin ideology. In the words of an actual expert, the political scientist Cass Mudd, he argues that unlike, say, fascism, which offers a broad view of how a society ought to operate, socially, economically, politically, populism is a rather narrow stance. It is against the establishment, however you define the establishment. It comes down to us versus them, the people versus the elite, a sort of throw out the bums, whoever they are, perspective on just about everything. But populism doesn't in and of itself suggest who and what ought to replace those bums. So like a fine wine to stinky cheese, it needs to be paired with a more robust ideology. And this is where we end up with the right-wing authoritarian populism of Jair Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban, the Front National, and yes, Donald Trump. It's also how we end up with the left-wing populism of, say, Bernie Sanders. That left-wing populism pits us, the ordinary people, against the elite at the top who perpetuate inequality. But the right-wing populism of Donald Trump pits a narrowly defined us against not simply the elite at the top, but a third group he accuses elites of favoring, the other. Immigrants, racial minorities, even women. The right and left here have something important in common, though. The populist leader decides who gets to be a part of us. This was certainly true of Bernie Sanders, who spent a lot of time in the 2016 election deciding who was a Gryffindor and who was a Slytherin, and persuading his followers that only he got to decide who was a true progressive. The kind of populism we're talking about today, though, is really the right-wing version. And what is alarming is that too many countries are seeing populist demagogues take hold of power by promising to throw out the bums who are giving government handouts to minorities, but who then consolidate power in undemocratic ways, inching ever closer to authoritarianism. Around the world, threats to a free press, fair elections, democratic institutions, the rights of minorities and women, and so much else are on the rise. And in America, we can't understate the role that race plays in this, and the specific role it played in the rise of Donald Trump. To understand why, it's worth briefly revisiting the history of populism in the United States. So in the late 19th century, after a severe economic recession, a group of farmers in the south and west of the country faced mounting debt and rising prices because of monopolies that were benefiting from giant government contracts and consolidating their own wealth. Think of the railroad and oil barons of the time. So in response, we saw the rise of activists fighting against this trend, forming economic cooperatives and starting self-help organizations. They went on to form the People's Party, which ran candidates up and down the ballot across the country. And what they wanted was real structural reform. This populist movement became dominant in the Democratic Party at the time, leading to the presidential nomination 3 times of William Jennings Bryan, the guy who famously said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a gold cross." So Bryan was a religious conservative Christian. One of his causes was fighting the teaching of evolution in public schools, but his populism tied economic reform with the social gospel, the rural religious values of America, which was a really interesting combination. However, there were still racial tensions even within the populism of old. Remember, this is after the Civil War with newly freed slaves. While some populists wanted to unite workers and farmers of all races and backgrounds against the banker class, others, including ones from the South, were in staunch opposition, making many African Americans feel safer in the Republican Party of the time. Take the Georgian populist, Tom Watson, who became a kind of demagogue in the 1910s and 20s. He railed against immigrants poisoning our shores and creating a glut of cheap labor for manufacturers, blaming Italians, Jews, and other European immigrants for all manner of ills. Sound familiar? Now, what I want to impart through this rapid run through American populist history is that from the beginning, there was a tension between economic justice for some of the people and economic justice for all of the people. There was a debate about who counted as us and who would be demonized as them. So now we come to Trump, whose America First slogan comes from a group that vehemently opposed American entry into World War II and was stacked full of anti-Semites. America First is a dog whistle. After the 2016 election, and I think this debate continues today, there was a lot of debate about what led to Trump's catastrophic win. Why did he make such gains with white voters without a college degree? And we're talking about white voters without a college degree. Much was made about a white working class out in the middle of the country that felt ignored by the Democrats, and specifically by President Obama and Hillary Clinton, ignored by an economy that had left him behind due to globalization and technology. New York Times reporters went out of their way to report on these left-behind Americans, meeting them in diners and coffee shops across the Midwest and South, struggling to understand why it is that they pulled the lever for an incompetent carnival barker. And initially, The argument was that they felt ignored, as we talked about, and a lot of the reasons that Sean gave are certainly valid. That after decades of manufacturing jobs going offshore, hollowing out their communities with nothing to replace them, they were fed up. The economy had left them behind, the theory went, and so they voted based on their economic anxiety. Indeed, how else could one explain those puzzling, maddening Obama-Trump voters, the millions of people who voted for the first black president once, even twice, and then switched over to vote for the white nationalists in 2016? It must be economic anxiety. Surely they couldn't be racist if they voted for Obama. Subsequent research has proven this theory wrong. Study after study has found that racial resentment was a far bigger driver than economic anxiety in the 2016 election. As the authors of a study released this fall wrote, quote, white voters with racially conservative or anti-immigrant attitudes switched votes to Trump at a higher rate than those with more liberal views on these issues. We find little evidence that economic dislocation and marginality were significantly related to vote switching in 2016. In fact, researchers found that racial resentment, in a sense, drove economic anxiety. And by the way, these studies have also uncovered another unsurprising factor in Trump voters' motivation: sexism. That's not to say that economic anxiety, and in particular, the growing inequality we see in countries like mine and yours, doesn't have political consequences. But the nature of that anxiety is complex, interwoven with racial anxiety as well. And here again, I have to separate my country from yours. We have a unique, particularly dark racial history, obviously rooted in the scourge of slavery that we've never really overcome, and that's different from other countries. But that's what I'm getting at here. Trump capitalized on the economic fears of the white working class within a narrative of existing racial and ethnic prejudices. This was not subtle. Trump explicitly played to those fears. This is the person who came to political prominence by questioning the birthright citizenship of America's first black president. His campaign announcement speech called Mexicans rapists, demonized immigrants, and called for a ban on Muslims entering the US. In every campaign speech, he returned to these themes. And in fact, his biggest campaign promise, to build a pointless wall on the southern border, was the cause of this most recent shutdown. Now, of course, since taking office, he hasn't actually implemented what one might call a populist agenda. His biggest legislative accomplishment was giving a giant tax cut to billionaires and corporations. His cabinet is chock full of the most corrupt kleptocrats since the Harding administration. And as the owner of properties that hold his political fundraisers and host foreign dignitaries, he's literally making money off of this presidency. Moreover, while the stock market is doing well and Trump has benefited from the growing economy that President Obama left him, there are fears that trouble may lie ahead, not just in my country, but around the world. At the same time, he has done nothing to address the very real economic security concerns of the white working class voters who elected him, and frankly, of the non-white working class voters who didn't elect him, but who also face a lot of the economic anxiety that Sean outlined so well. Their coal mining jobs aren't coming back, and his solution is to rail against clean energy. Republicans have not been serious about helping workers figure out how to make it in today's economy, especially those workers without a post-secondary education. They just keep promising them a return to some mythical past. And in fact, Trump is exacerbating fears about rising income inequality and feeding this notion that governments, business, media, all the institutions that help make society work are just there to benefit the rich. As my former boss, President Obama, said when he spoke in Montreal last year, this increasing concentration of wealth we're seeing just makes people even more cynical and polarized and less trusting of each other. What he said was, it's part of what leads people to turn to populist alternatives that may not actually deliver. If you look around the world, we see signs of what this could look like. There are signs that the status quo isn't working for large swaths of humanity. And the billionaires at Davos aren't doing anything to fix it. I've been really disturbed to hear the reports coming out of that really ridiculous conference, where it appears that Davos participants continue to maximize their personal gains while also accommodating nationalist populism. It's sort of a split the baby approach, and it's deeply problematic, especially when that nationalist populism turned authoritarianism poses an existential threat to democracy. So what should we, meaning people who care about democracy and democratic values, do about this? And like Sean, I don't have answers, maybe just more questions. I'm not saying that economic anxiety isn't a very real part of the growth of populism generally, in my home country and around the world. It is certainly fueling the left-wing populism of someone like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's making waves with pretty bold, progressive economic ideas, bold for America. What I'm saying is that we need to address both the economic anxiety and the racial anxiety. We need to grapple with rising income inequality that's contributing to economic anxiety and find ways to help people deal with a new and changing economy, especially in the face of a future economy where AI might wipe out more jobs than we care to admit. At the same time, we need to face head-on the racial tensions that my country, for one, has never worked out. If we don't do both, we're bound to be ruled by these demagogue authoritarians like Trump, who promise a subset of the population the moon. For too long, neither major political party in my country has done these two things. Democrats talk about issues related to race and ethnic differences, but it often feels transactional, kind of as a foil to Trump. But I don't think they're doing much, or they have done much, to move us as a country toward any real reconciliation with our past. Republicans are wholesale ignoring everyone who isn't white and pretending that race doesn't matter. And perhaps more surprisingly, neither party has come up with a robust economic vision for the new economy toward which we are rapidly careening, one that will need government and the private sector to work together. It's no longer enough to talk about job training programs. We need to totally rethink our economy to match the rapid rise of workforce disrupting technology. And my hope is that in the next election, the Democrats put forth a meaningful, inclusive vision of an economy where everybody has the opportunity to work and make a decent living. And I do believe that part of this economic vision does involve regulating the companies that have made an awful lot of money off the backs of working people while making it increasingly harder for people to make a living. And if we're talking about companies like Facebook and Google, for our democracy to function. We also need to restore sanity to the political process in America, which means getting money out of politics, ending gerrymandering, and making it easier, not harder, for people to vote. For the populist strongman, when you have demonized every institution that makes society work, and you have demonized everybody who is a them, when the political process itself is no longer an option, then you, the strongman, are the only person who can bring salvation. I alone can fix it, Trump told America in his speech accepting the presidential nomination at the Republican National Convention in 2016. But if you don't fix it, then what happens? Well, Trump's approval ratings, for one, which are in the toilet, he has the lowest two-year average approval of any president in polls dating back 70 years. And I also take heart in the results of our most recent election in 2018, where Democrats took over one house of Congress as well as state governments across America. And the candidates who won did it not by focusing on Trump's failures, but on what they can do for the American people. So it's a start. I'm feeling more hopeful than I've felt since November 2016. And I know I've spent all this time mostly talking about America, and I hope we get to a lot more during the discussion, because I think what I'm seeing at home is also what I'm seeing, frankly, in Narendra Modi's India, where he is stoking anti-Muslim anxiety and pairing that with economic anxiety. And he's not the only one. But I just want to close by saying that the kind of dangerous authoritarian populism that's taking hold across the globe has more room to maneuver when we are silent and when we don't offer the kind of proactive, really bold solutions that Sean was starting to talk about. My country's leaders no longer speak of democratic values, the strength of our alliances, and human rights when they go around the world. And when they do, they lack credibility because my government is kidnapping people's children at the border. But Canada can. And it's more important than ever for Canada and your leaders to be a voice for democratic values and to speak forcefully against anti-democratic trends and to stand up for the kind of freedom we all believe in. So thank you all for having me. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I've already learned a lot just from listening to Sean, so I look forward to talking.
Thanks. So we'll have about 15 minutes. I'll put a few questions and then we'll go quickly to the audience. So the themes I want to touch on are identity, economy, and the relationship between public policy and communications, which are, I think, the themes that you captured. It's not that there's a dearth of good economic policy ideas. I think on the left and the right, we have seen some interesting growth-oriented ideas. It just seems like there's no market for those ideas right now, and that rhetoric to your point about rhetoric versus ideology, is trumping a more comprehensive growth agenda. How do you make that the ideas that are out there around college access, around the job training issues, around a number of the economic solutions, the economic ills out there, how do you make those imaginative enough to capture the imagination so that it's not a border wall or a 70% income tax rate that are the ideas that are going to capture the imagination?
I don't mean to be disagreeable, but I'm afraid I don't agree with the premise. I think what you're describing is basically more of the same. I think the left and the right, at least the mainstream left and the right, are both committed to the idea that the right premise underpinning economic policy is about growing the economic pie as large as we can and then redistributing the gains of that pie to those who are, to the losers of that exercise of kind of hyper efficiency. And many of us have done pretty well in that environment. But I think, of course, the types of policy that you're describing ought to be part of the debate. But I think in a lot of ways, I talked earlier about how kind of radicalized I've been by the past 30 months, 36 months. I think we need to have a more fundamental discussion about whether we ought to be committed to the idea that growing the economic pie as large as we can is the right policy objective. Maybe we need to be prepared to accept a slightly smaller pie if that means people have more opportunity. But then we need to reconcile ourselves with some of the costs of a smaller pie, including, as I mentioned earlier, that it will have implications not just for our own societies, but others around the world who've benefited from this commitment to hyper-efficiency and globalization. So I think the type of policy debate that is occurring on the left and the right outside of the limelight of politics is interesting and important, and all of these things will help on the margins. I don't diminish them. But I think, I've come to think in recent months that I think there are more fundamental discussions to be had, and I think those are discussions that have been excluded from our politics.
I think Sean's idea of having to reduce the pie generally is a really compelling one, and I'm really interested to sort of learn more because I think that might be right. I will say that one reason that I might disagree with your premise, it's weird to be agreeing this much with a conservative. I really don't know what to do with myself. It's strange. Is that in America, at least, and I think this may not be true in a lot of places, but in America, in part because of the rise of a left in opposition to Donald Trump, and people like Ocasio-Cortez being in Congress and being such an effective communicator through social media, she has actually jump-started policy debates that on issues that in the US, at least, which is a far less redistributive country than Canada, are pretty radical for us. They're not radical enough, I think, for a lot of reasons. But the fact that she has gotten economists to debate on Twitter the 70% marginal tax is a really big deal for us. That a Green New Deal is even on the table, and just that people are having these conversations is pretty remarkable. I will just say that the direction in which I have been radicalized of late is that I think the economy that we're talking about now is just not going to exist, I have a toddler in her working lifetime. I think that we need to be really serious about the fact that the robots are going to start making themselves at some point. And I know it sounds like I'm crazy, but I really think that we have to take technology seriously and be totally radical in our thinking about the economy of the future.
Well, it seems to me that there's one pulling on the conversation. There seems to be two spaces where the left and the right who are concerned about populism could really come align. And you're seeing it a bit in the States, and maybe not so much in Canada. The first is around corporate concentration and aggressively tackling that. The second is around a real aggressive reformist education agenda that serves all. I'm not sure if those are the two only ones. I'm not sure if we can build a policy consensus around that. I'm not sure if those are enough. I'm not sure if you can make those imaginative to cut through the rhetoric. Do you see any potential to build something based on maybe some of those ideas?
I think so. People may know, if you're prepared to look beyond Twitter and the 24-hour news cycle, I think there is, the one upside of the Trump presidency is that I think it's starting to catalyze some of this dynamic thinking. Just before the end of 2018, the American Enterprise Institute, which is a center-right think tank, and the Brookings Institution, which is a center-left think tank, co-published a paper on work and opportunity. And each of the recommendations were supported in full. That is to say, it wasn't a negotiation of we want this recommendation and you want that recommendation. The authors across the spectrum were committed to each of the recommendations, and many of them centered on education reform. I spent a bit of time this week with Tyler Cowen, who some of you may know is a center-right or pretty classical economic thinker, and he's bullish on education reform. He thinks there is an opening across the spectrum to fix the broken American education system. But not to sound like a broken record, but I do think it's important to emphasize that even though Cortez is talking about a 70% marginal tax rate, and we can debate, as I said in my remarks, the kind of the efficiency costs of that. I mean, it's still basically accepting the premise that the goal is what center-right thinker Orrin Cass calls economic piety. That is, we grow the economic pie as much as we can, and we tax the gains of those who succeed in that market structure by some magnitude. Maybe it's as high as 70%, and we redistribute it to those who haven't performed well. I think it misreads what people are asking for. I suspect I'm less concerned about economic equality than most people in this room. But I think where we can agree that I think the demands of people are greater than simply greater economic equality and maintaining high levels of consumption. I think people are seeking more than that. I think they're seeking real opportunity in an economy that is becoming increasingly bifurcated. And as I say, I think that requires more than tinkering with on the margins of the tax system. I think it means reconceptualizing how we think about our economic objectives.
I think that's largely right. The challenge is that so the incentives for the people who are enjoying large segments of the pie are to basically maintain the status quo. And so when you have those interested in economic inequality proposing, say, high marginal tax rates, the reason they're that if that is tinkering at the margins and working within the system is because they're just trying to get any of the crumbs at the table. There's so, and in America at least, money is inextricably tied to political power. And so it's really hard to make inroads and to suggest, and I mean, they're already calling her all kinds of names just for suggesting that. So you can imagine if you suggest more, and if you suggest the billionaires just make less because we shrink the pie, that's not gonna go over well either. So I get the the gist of what you're saying. I think that the challenge also, by the way, is that income inequality in America, and I don't know how true that is here, is inextricably tied with education. So, your parents' income, which translates to your zip code because of America's screwed up housing policies, translates to whether or not you will get a decent education. And until we repair that, which unfortunately does have something to do with, unfortunately or fortunately, has something to do with redistribution, we're not gonna get to where Professor Cowen wants us to go. At least I don't see how we will, especially because there was the money in federal education is not, at this point, working in streams that make sense.
I would just make an observation about the growing the pie question. And one way I don't think we've thought about this in Canada is a respect in which in Canada we're actually more challenged than you are in the United States. And that's the cost of living crisis that we have in our major cities in Canada. And a growing the pie model And we have a cost of living crisis and an indebtedness crisis, which is worse in the United States for larger numbers of people in Toronto, the Greater Toronto Area, and Vancouver and the Lower Mainland than you would have in comparable American cities. And so growing the pie, just a pure economic growth and redistribution agenda doesn't take into account the fact that you're still falling behind with respect to the really nightmarish cost of living increases that people are facing. So that's something I think people of different perspectives in Canada need to take into account. Just one question about identity, and then I want to come to the audience because we haven't talked about that yet in these chairs. So first, Sean, how to get conservatives or conservatively oriented people more accepting of others to be in the us?
I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I think there are reasonable debates to be had about immigration policy. I think there are reasonable debates to be had about integration, the role of public policy in supporting integration, not just economic integration, but social and cultural integration. I think those conversations need to be part of our politics. I think it's problematic that we've seen several polls in the past 6 months in Canada show that a fairly significant share of the population has misgivings with our immigration system, and yet our mainstream politics has basically precluded that conversation. I think that's not only is it undemocratic, I think it's ultimately unhealthy, and it will produce problems down the road. We're already seeing, of course, Maxime Bernier's efforts with the People Party. That said, I think conservatives could not, if conservatives lose from our DNA, from our perspective, the immigrant story, I think it is, I think that's at the moment I kind of exit the door. I live a pretty selfish life. I don't owe much to a lot of people. I basically do whatever I want. And the selfishness of the selflessness, rather, of the immigrant story is so compelling. It is so connected to the way I think about the world, that if we cease being a voice for that kind of selfless commitment to bettering one's life and bettering the lives of people's children, as I say, I think that's the kind of moment I exit the door. And so one of the things that I've been working hard to achieve within conservative circles is distinguishing between reasonable policy conversations about the number of immigrants we permit each year, the composition of the number of immigrants we admit each year, the programming or legal framework around integration and so on, but separating that from the fundamental recognition of the inherent good of the immigration story.
And Sarada, a version of the same question to you. After the presidential election, a number of sociologists went down to rural parts of America with hillbilly elegy in their pockets, trying to learn about a constituency that they didn't realize existed in America for decades or centuries. And in Canada, we have, I think, some aspects of the populist left looking to similarly include certain people, and with a very explicit rectification agenda where there have been excluded people who now need to be included. And it's possible that some people who are in the majority identity or have other identities that are not racialized, not gendered, not indigenous, not in the same way, are feeling excluded from a populist left conversation. Can you speak to that?
Yeah,
and whether to and how to include those voices?
Yeah, I think it was such a tricky moment in the post-election when, as you say, sociologists went to so-called forgotten America. I mean, I think the the nature of all of that is really complex. And by the way, nobody was going down to, working class African American communities in Mississippi and asking those folks why they're struggling. The New York Times was not interested in that. But I think, just to sort of touch a little bit on what your question to Sean, because I think it's relevant. America has actually always does immigration integration actually pretty well. We are not Europe. We don't have those issues, which is why the sort of backlash against immigration has been so interesting, to me at least, to watch. When, generally speaking, there's a reason that no border state federal representative is for Trump's wall, including Republicans. It's a much more complicated picture. Immigrants generally assimilate in America pretty well comparatively. So I think this is such a complex question that you ask, and I think, again, I have a hard time separating economic anxiety from racial anxiety in those communities, but I also feel like Democrats for a long time have not done a good enough job, because the conversation has been about redistribution, done a good enough job of explaining that the government is not just taking money from you and giving it to somebody who doesn't look like you. And in part, this is because our safety net is kind of broken. It has a lot of holes in it. The federal system of support doesn't make a ton of sense. And all of this time that manufacturing jobs have been leaving these communities, politicians on the left and the right have been, but mostly, frankly, on the right, have been promising those communities that those jobs would come back if you just elect us. And decade after decade, that has not happened, and those communities have been hollowed out. So I think part of this comes down to telling a truer story, but it also comes down to, from my perspective on the left, offering a more unified vision of workers, right? Bringing together people from all political sides, but also all races, who are all struggling to make it in this economy, and painting a new picture of coming together and finding a way forward. And I think that President Obama was able to do that in 2008 and a little bit in 2012, but in part because of the racial backlash, we lost that in 2016. And I'm just sort of hoping that there's a way to sort of crystallize that again. But I think it's going to be an enormous challenge.
Can we collect just one or two questions or comments, and we'll just have to get them down? Oh, I'm sorry.
Let's do two at a time.
Yeah.
And then you guys can, Okay, John, I'm coming to you. Hang on.
After 40, how's that? Oh, that's better. After 44 years as a disability rights activist, it is my view that both the left and the right have failed the disabled community when it comes to the need to bring more of us out of the margins and into the mainstream. I think that's particularly true in the notion of trickle-down economics, which I think is one of the greatest big lies that's ever been concocted in human history. Because if there are any benefits, the trickle doesn't seem to have a clue where my community lives. So my question to both of you is, should the disabled community have any hope for the future, or is the next generation of folks with disabilities going to be consigned to the scrap heap of history like many of us feel we have been in the past?
That's one. Scott. I'm going to
This is a question for Mr. Speer. I'm sure you're aware of it, that I think in the late 50s and early 60s, Canada had a very dynamic economy. You could go to university without student debt. You could make enough money in summer to go to university. But there was one thing at that time, and I'm sure you're aware of it, the marginal rate was over 90%. The president of the company made about 20 times what the ordinary worker made. And we realized that the disparity between the rich and the poor is totally out of control. So maybe 90% might be a bit excessive, but we don't need to lower the taxes on the rich.
Thank you. A question for Sean. You mentioned that your thinking started to change about 36 months ago, and that predates Trump's election. So I'm wondering what's happened in Canada over the last 36 months that may have been changing your thinking? Because I know a lot of the discussion's been about the U.S.
That's a great question. And I'll do one more, and then, because you'll forget, okay?
Thank you. This is sort of just a question in regards to how we're sort of viewing populism now as a, and the way that you have been explaining it is sort of trying to fight it in a sense of how can we make it so that people are less in the fringes, so to speak. But we're living in a world where these things, there's constant change. And Mr. Speer, you said that change comes incrementally, and you believe that change comes incrementally, and that might have been true early on, but now we're seeing that, and not just in the States, everywhere else in the world, that these changes are happening constantly, and when we're focusing on one group, we're disenfranchising another. Are we moving towards a world where more of this is going to be, populism is going to be mainstream, and if that's the case, is it going to be a kind of a downward spiral of this is the establishment now, and then in the next 4 years, that the new guy's going to be anti-establishment that time again? So is that sort of something that we should be concerned about, or is it something that we have to sort of embrace and make sure that we could control?
Where should we start?
Do you want to start with John's question?
Sure.
Yeah, I completely accept the premise.
Yep.
This gets at the heart, in a way, of why these questions have a technocratic element to them. How do we design a disability support system that enables those with disabilities to have opportunity, to live with dignity, and so on? I think as a conservative, for what it's worth, I mean, it seems to me that is one of the first orders of government. But though there are, as we think about how to design that system, we also have to think about how other priorities interact. So let me be concrete at the risk of falling into abstraction. I happen to be opposed to the idea of a universal basic income, in large part because I think it dedicates scarce resources to able-bodied people, in part at the expense of those with disabilities. And so, as I say, I think as we think about how to have a robust and generous regime for those with disabilities, I think we also need to think about how it interacts with other public priorities. On the question of marginal tax rates and the 1950s and 60s, I think point taken. I would say that the nature of the economy was markedly different, so much so that I think there are limits to the comparison. In the 1950s and 60s, there was tremendous opportunity for those without post-secondary education to participate fully in the economy. I think as you look across the economic landscape now, those opportunities are increasingly diminished. And so I think, as I say, I think there are one of the risks of nostalgia, which is common on the right these days, is it precludes us to look forward at the opportunities and challenges in our current economy. On the question of the Canadian political landscape and my thinking, I think Canadian conservatives. One of the things I regret is that the Conservative Party is called the Conservative Party, and I self-identify as a small c conservative, but not necessarily a partisan, which becomes difficult nomenclature. I think Canadian big C conservative politics has become too oppositional, and not focused enough on a positive vision for government. It's not to say that I believe in big government. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if I believe in a smaller government than probably more than most anyone here. But I do think we need to talk about what we think government is for, and I think Canadian conservatism has increasingly lost that. On the question of trying to push back against the forces of populism and whether there's a risk that populism becomes mainstream, I would say becoming president of the United States is pretty mainstream. And it seems to me the lesson for Canadians is trying to proactively address some of these pressure points, whether it's economic anxiety or cultural anxiety or other forces that seem to be drawing people out of mainstream politics and into these unconventional political vehicles. We can learn the lessons of the United States and the UK and elsewhere, and I think if we fail to do so, we'll risk ending up in where they are. And I would just say it was an important point made earlier, which is a failure of mainstream politics to respond to these questions. I think is the principal reason the U.S. finds itself in its current political turmoil. And so I think it behooves all of us across the political spectrum to rededicate ourselves to a constructive politics that is proactively trying to get at these issues.
Can I just add two things? I just wanted to respond to John's really important question. I think, both of our countries are probably ahead of many countries in terms of, we passed the American with Disabilities Act in the 90s and have made sort of accommodations for differently abled people. But it is true that it's not about accommodation, I think, at least. I feel like what we're actually doing is just leaving opportunity on the table when people of, who are differently abled don't have the opportunity to participate in our economy. And it starts actually at the level of education. So to me, if we are sort of moving into a more radical space where we can really rethink our economy, especially with sort of, instead of fearing technology, which I kind of do, admittedly, as a Luddite, but thinking about the ways in which the economy is going to change for everybody, how can we sort of reimagine it to make sure that all people, regardless of ability, are able to participate actively and contribute to our economy and to our societies. And, whether it's more inclusive educational opportunities, which we're starting to see some really interesting things happening at home, in the States, to, workplace opportunities and the way that technology can enable people to participate in robust ways. I think that we should actually be optimistic about the opportunity ahead. And then just wanted to respond to your point about populism, because obviously I agree that marginal tax rates should be higher. What I fear right now about populism on the left and the right and the most mainstream populism in the world, in my country, is just the fundamental collapse of trust in the institutions that have always made our societies work, whether it's our free press, whether it's government from the local level all the way to the national level, multilateral institutions, all of these institutions that have always kind of helped people believe in us in something, right, and that have been part of our social contracts. As sort of small c community has shrunk with the loss of associations and a decline in religiosity and all those reasons, and you see a lack of trust in those institutions, you're going to continue to see a rise of populism both on the left and the right, and that concerns me. I think that we actually ought to be working towards rebuilding trust in those institutions by making them more representative and by making them more responsive to all people's needs, and making people feel like they're a part of something again, both at the sort of community association level all the way to our national newspapers and our press. And so that, as we think about what lies ahead, and again, not to sort of keep crapping on Davos, but that's exactly that's exactly the kind of thing that makes people cynical, and we ought to be sort of moving away from that and into something that's, I think, far more inclusive and representative.
And maybe we'll get a teaser about Davos from Maria Ressa in her 2:00 keynote. Thank you, Sarada, Peri, and Speer, for giving energy and nuance to this conversation.